Today, I have Evangelos Avramakis on the show, and he is the head of Digital Ecosystems R&D at Swiss Re. And I'm very excited to dive into your story, into some of the lessons you learned along the way, and some of the passion and purpose behind everything you do. I'm always excited about that topic. So welcome to the show. Let's dive right into your story. Can you maybe tell us about maybe one or two sentences about you, and then about maybe one or two defining moments that really shaped your journey as a person, as a leader?
Oh, good question. Okay, sometimes I have to think about that as well, but it gets more and more clear with the older I get, I think so. So who I am, I was born here actually in Switzerland. So my parents immigrated a couple of years ago. So I grew up here, went to the university, and did my whole career more or less within Switzerland, but also in a very international and multicultural context. And this is something I think this is quite specific or quite unique. So I'm really interested in understand something I don't have any clue out of it. So I'm really curious about understanding things which are around why this is happening, but also try to come up with solution. Is there a way of doing it better? So no matter where this has started, it was always a kind of innovation motor inside of me. And this is where I am right now.
This is great. Thank you. I mean, it's very, I'm interested in, people's drive, and seems to be a lot of curiosity behind that. So let's quickly dive into some of the defining moments that really shaped you as a person, as a leader. Is there something that you remember where, that was either a defining moment, sometimes it was simply a path or a part of the journey? Is there something that you remember that really shaped you as a person and you as a leader?
I think there are different aspects where the same structure more or less appears, and it makes things very transparent who we are, or who I am. And one of them, as just an example, I was working at the ETH as an assistant in the laboratory of biomechanics. So at that time, this was more than 20 years ago now, was very interesting. How do the Roger Federers today, how the shoe sole designs, how they are constructed. And we talked a lot with Adidas and Nike. And my thought was, okay, on running shoe might be easier to do because this is on a regular base. So you just do the same thing 100,000 times. But if indoor shoes are slightly more complex. So I started designing like an idiot, right? So many sketches and try to think about, okay, we can do this. And we came up with actually a solution. So which is, unfortunately, this has never gone to the market, not even on a prototype, yes. But, the kind of how to solve a much more complex problem with, let's say, the same technology or insight, that is something which was already there. Perhaps another aspect was more concrete to the insurance industry. So how do people buy insurance, and how can we make their lives much easier? And what do we have to bring them or to provide them in order that they can really take a decision, because it's a very complex journey they have to go through. And I was always curious about how to do that, also having a lot of people around and, challenging ideas. And at the beginning, you do a lot of mistakes, right? You might know how it works, but in the very end, actually, you have to learn based on your mistakes. And I think this is something, especially in the insurance industry, where we are not the consumers. We might be experts, we might be leaders, we might be managing very specific aspects in the whole journey, but the user is the user, and we are far away from knowing what the user thinks, behaves, feels. And this is something, if you don't explore it, you might not really understand, okay, how a potential solution might look like.
Now, this is some very specific areas, and I like where you're already going. Because we're already going into the second part, because there seems to be a lot of passion for that journey and to really understand the people, and that curiosity once again behind everything. So let's go right there. I really like that area. So let's talk about the bigger purpose, the why behind it. So, when I look at it from the outside, insurance, for me, it's not the most sexy industry. If I look at it from the outside, the more I talk to people at the inside, the more I go like, wow, there's there's quite some really interesting aspects in this whole thing. What made you go from designing, indoor sport shoes at the university to eventually going into industry? What was that?
Actually, I think there are several reasons, but one was a very economic, simplistic one. There's no market in Switzerland for doing sport shoe design. So it's just in existence. So I had to relocate to Canada, the US. And so Nike's not here. Nike and Adidas are somewhere else. That's a very obvious one. The second one, I was working a lot of years on strategy consulting. And then I want to go away from consulting companies into, doing something in real life where we have a kind of responsibility. So the role might be slightly bit different. And I thought that, something I didn't have a clue about because I was never involved in any kind of insurance related topics. There was a position, an open position for something in between product management, strategy, and marketing. That fitted very best, although I didn't have a clue of any of those topics. So actually, the kind of manager, he hired me because he said, by the way, you don't have to understand insurance. It's going to be very easy for you to get in. And if you get in, then you might really challenge also the status quo. And this is something which was actually the case. So I already asked at the beginning, why do this kind of products, the product naming, as an example, was a huge issue for me, because if you are not an insider, how do you get an insight about what this product is about? Because you're looking from outside and this does not mean anything to you. And the next one was the product components. Now, sometimes the product components make not really sense for the end consumer if it reads that, perhaps in the details, but nobody wants to read details in the very end. So it was really about how to make things much more easier. So I think that getting from outside, it helps a lot, but also understanding when you're inside, what are the kind of basic rules or thoughts around that and the components and concepts. This is also interesting. So at the very end, you might have to really combine both worlds. The danger is the longer you're in, the more you assume that people understand what you're talking about. And this is more of a problem, because you have to think about, okay, getting from outside is also something very fresh. You get new ideas how you can look at it. And then if you start combining with internal thoughts, then things are getting really more complex and more complicated, because people might have tried it but never reached it. As an example, how to get rid of a signature. That might seem to be something easy. So today, or in iTunes, before, you didn't have to sign anything on an online sales in general. But in insurance, it's still the case, right? And it's something like people really, really believe in it, because it's really something, if you sign it, then it's something like a contract. So the beliefs in that is how can you get rid of something, because it makes the process much more convenient. But from a consumer perspective, this is something I didn't have to sign. So there might be something wrong here in the process. And these are the kind of ways how to look at problems, but also how to try to solve these kind of problems. And getting a clear view on inside, but also having always a kind of external view, but also a kind of tech view, how to look at it from a business and tech perspective. This was always in a combination where I thought I was really enthusiastic about that.
Now, I find that really fascinating what you mentioned there in terms of the process, because if you look at this process of, digital signature or signature in general, from a company perspective, from a offering perspective, you basically say, well, it's great, we can get rid of this and it makes everything easier, maybe cheaper and faster and everything. So great, let's just do that. Then, and you probably thinking, if you just look at that, you're thinking it's a pain, for the customer to do that as well. So let's get rid of that. But then when you dive really, really deep into the customer and the behaviors and really understanding the customer, you realize there's a component that may be worthwhile keeping something like that makes totally no sense from a rational perspective, but maybe from an emotional perspective, it makes sense if it's done in a more simplified way. So this kind of stuff is really fascinating to me, because it has everything to do with really, really understanding the customers, which also leads me to the second piece, ecosystems. Obviously, it's in your title as well, but it's something that in the last conversation we talked about a lot, and it seems to be something that you're really passionate about. So I'm trying to understand, what do you what is your idea of an ecosystem, and why are you so passionate about this kind of topic or this kind of area as well?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's now becoming a kind of a buzzword because everybody talks about ecosystem. So it seems to me like everything is an ecosystem. It was before it might be a platform. Now it's an ecosystem. So everybody has already an ecosystem, which is actually not the case. But people are, summing up ideas or concepts within this ecosystem term and then use it, which is fine. But if you really dig into that, so we talk about digital ecosystem. So it's not a business ecosystem. It's about how to exchange digital information and also digital services and products. And how can you bring in different parties within a very specific focus? Could be a functional focus like health or fitness. Could be also a functional focus like mobility or in the commercial space. The question is, what do you have to build in order the consumer feels guided, but also that the services are done and delivered in a very, very efficient and effective way? So it's more or less a consumer focus where you have to think about, and then to think about how can we build our products and components and the process around this customer journey. In the very end, we have to think about consumers' problems or so-called jobs to be done. So the jobs to be done theory is based on actually it's a behavior thing. So people try to solve something, and the question is they cannot articulate what they want to solve. They cannot tell you this is something I want to reach, rather than they're trying to do that and they don't get really answer and they struggle. And then this is where it gets really interesting, because if you try to observe this kind of behavior, you might identify some key crucial points why users behave like this and the other one. So if you get into an ecosystem environment, only to plug in products and services is just not enough. It's about understanding the customer jobs, and also the customer journey, where he comes from, what he's trying to do next, and then how to design the product and service around the jobs to be done theory. So it's more complicated than before, because before you had it, if you had the customer touch point, you can easily more or less design it around what your thoughts are. Now you get in a more or less foreign environment where the customer journey might be there, and you have to think about how can you plug in with your product and components. I know that this makes sense, but also that is very convenient. And on the other hand, it really fits to the customer's problems. And I think this kind of mindset is really needed in order to try to solve this kind of things. So in majority, people or consumers will not tell you this is something we have to solve and I need this in this ecosystem. This is not the way it's going to work. It's going to be the other way around. It's going to be the other way around, like, okay, trying to understand what the ecosystem in its whole could try to solve. So how we can extend the kind of product and services with a variety of partners involved. So this could be insurance companies, this could be health providers, this could be mobility, no matter what. But how can we make this kind of touch point or app or ecosystem, whatever it's going to be, much more relevant to the end consumer and much more convenient for him? And this is why we have to understand first, listen and understand, not try to build already and then try to solve it and figure it out. Okay, this was a nice try, but it doesn't work out as well.
Listen and understand. That's kind of like what I took away from this. I mean, really, you got this incredible passion for really understanding what's going on, the behaviors and the in-depth, like the thing behind the curtain, because if you ask somebody, what do you want? They'll tell you all kinds of things, but maybe it's only 20% relevant, because many people they can't really express exactly what they want either, right? It's very difficult sometimes. That's why also, when we talk about data today, I find that really fascinating, because there's so many more things today we can now understand about people that are more true than what they would have said if you asked them, in a more, simplistic way. I find that very, very fascinating, because then you can actually design these kinds of things, these ecosystems and apps and offerings and all these kinds of things in a way that are incredibly relevant. So this is a very, very fascinating topic. I mean, you touched on it a little bit already, but I'd love to hear your point of view, kind of like where we're heading. So let's talk about insurance, and you have a very good in-depth view of kind of like where we are today, and also what the potential is if we do it right, and if we really understand the consumers, the customers. Where do you think insurance, or the way consumers interact with insurance, is going to be in, I don't know, 2 or 3 years down the line?
First of all, I'd like a little bit to focus on what's happening now, and then try to get some conclusion what might happen tomorrow. So in the whole InsurTech field, no matter whether it's about analytics or customer journey or customer experience, it's about fixing the past. It's more or less try to understand how the consumer behave and try to come up with relevant services, especially on the front end. So the front end is very convenient because we are used to the best experience ever when using other apps. So we don't compete in the insurance environment, we compete in the experience environment, which is a completely other field. But what we try to do as an industry, we try to keep up at, let's say, the best we can with good experience. I don't say great experience, but good experience. And we do try to do that with InsurTech companies, with technology, with customer behavior understanding, behavior economics, and everything around that. So we try to fix the past and perhaps a little bit the present. So where does this heading to? I think, based on perhaps I'm a little bit exaggerating. Years ago, perhaps 20 years ago, our product components were done. We had some great product people. They designed products on paper. They put it perhaps in a PowerPoint slide. And then they used sales channels in order to push the product to the end consumer. That was a couple of years ago. The factory was more or less in the back end, far away from the consumer. And this is where you had to convince the sales channels rather than the consumer, because the sales channels had the power in doing that. Then, where we are heading now the last couple of years, we try to figure out what are the sales channels trying to do and what is the consumer trying to do. So we try to focus more on, focus groups and all this market analysis, focusing on the sales channels, but also on the consumer. So at least the product is getting closer to the consumer. That's the point. But the more data we get from the consumer, the more we can derive behavioral insights out of it, the more the consumer, is getting, or the factory is getting just next to the relevant point. This means that in the future, we might generate the products where they are on the spot in real time, because the data is going to be there where the consumer is. So I'm more or less not only fascinated, but believing in, if the consumer exchanges relevant data for us, we can provide a kind of value, then the factory is not going to be done in the back end somewhere, but it's going to be dynamically just on the spot where it's going to be relevant for the consumer. And so this is a significant shift towards how we have to design the products, but also the experiences. So it's a kind of combination. One is to understand, but also then to try to derive the relevant experience and product out of that. And this can only happen there where it's really relevant. So as an example, years ago we sold, or still now, we sold life insurance, especially in Switzerland, as a long-term kind of product, right? 10 years, 5 years, 20 years. But no matter how the consumer is changing his life, whether it's married, yes and no, and yes, the products might be flexible, but in the very end, you don't get an information back of the consumer, so you don't adapt the product to its real life. Imagine we have a kind of closer relationship with the consumer. We can easily adapt, let's say, his lifestyle. So we need a different connection to the consumer in order to get it done. So thinking about what will happen in the future, I take now another aspect, like in mobility. So today I own a car, and but on the other hand, if I work especially in the urban environment, I don't need a car going to work for that. So the public services play for the time being a significant role. In the future, the mobility service might play a significant role. So we have now Ubers, and Uber is extending his platform, or the platform, to rather a mobility service. other players will exactly try to do this as well. So BMW is doing that, Mercedes is doing that, but other players are doing exactly the same thing. So it's going to be how to have a very close connection actually to the end consumer. So we will see a lot of things going into creating this kind of platform or ecosystem, especially in a digital way. Imagine now, 5 to 10 years from now, you have 10 kind of Ubers within Zurich or in Berlin or in London. So what's going to change from the consumer perspective? So do you have 10 apps and then you try to, to get a ride for, no, you're not going to do that, right? It's absolutely clear that there will be somebody trying to create a service offering exactly what you need as a consumer. The question is, what's going to happen for the platform providers, for Ubers? So all the 10 Ubers, they have to compete in the same field. So they will have to start differentiating. And differentiating means that they have to put additional service on that, or they will only compete on price. So you will have exactly this kind of, the kind of trade-off you have to think about. And the question is, what does this mean now in the very end for the insurance industry? Do we have to adapt into this market in order to stay relevant? And how do we gonna get exactly the same of data in order to push our products, or it's just there and the consumer has not to think about that? So there's a significant impact on the behavioral side of the consumer, on the market side, where we have a huge offering doing more or less a similar thing, but also from an insurance side, okay, how do we have to adapt our business model in order to stay in this close relationship with a variety of platform providers or ecosystems involved? And this is something quite fascinating because this starts happening now, but will have a huge impact in the future. And imagine if there's another component on top of that, like self-driving cars or logistics services. So you'll have mobility service and logistics service doing more or less the same thing, transporting things from A to B, could be people or people or things, like food delivery, whatever it's going to be. So this kind of environment will be the future. The question is, how do we get prepared there? The only change will be that you have much more providers, but also you might have autonomous services doing that. So how to get started now, because you know that the end of the story for the next phase will be exactly that one. And this is something we are trying to define how the future might look like, but also how the business models and insurance might change over time, and how to get prepared for this kind of stuff.
Very, very fascinating in terms of like where all of this is heading. Very, very exciting. Now, in terms of the things you work on and the things you've worked on so far, is there any kind of short story you can tell where there was really a lot of, or like one key lesson that came out for you that you really embraced? Maybe it was a failure story, maybe it was a success story. Was there something in the near past that you can share?
We were thinking about more than a year ago now about how to enter the shared economy environment. At that time, we were not, we did not have a kind of product or business model where we could easily plug in, like to Airbnbs or to Expedia or whatever is going to be, about sharing. There's a new risk actually emerging, and the question is how to cope with that, but also how to plug in our services into this new field of sharing economy. And I think we had some great people here also thinking very much in the future, saying, what does this mean and what do we have to cope with? But from a management perspective, this was very relevant, but not really into our core, right? Our core is reinsurance, we have corporate solutions, and we have the life capital with the iptiQ models. But this kind of defining the problem, because the sales channels are not the same. So we talk here about platform business rather than primary insurance companies. So we had to define something that people felt really fascinating, and we tried to do this, but finally we could not succeed because of different reasons. But one of the key aspects was the other players in the field played exactly into this field, and they were to some extent successful, more successful, or they try to do it in a different way. So the question is, how can we try to put this in a frame where the management understands what we try actually to solve? 1 year later, because there were other activities going on, it was really about understanding what's happening on the consumer side. And what does this mean later on if you really want to stay relevant, no matter with our primary insurance partners, or if you go direct with the models we have, that we have to think about carefully how we're going to prepare this grant for the future. So for the time being, we have set this up. Actually, this is our EPTQ models, which are trying to do exactly this piece. And I think it's not because I did it or other projects. It was exactly the right time to get this started. But the initial thought was not to understand more or less the combined ratio or the loss ratio on the product. It was, to me, more or less to understand what's the behavior aspect and that why people are, using Airbnbs and why insurance might be relevant into an Airbnb context. Although we don't play in this game right now, but it was about, the customer touch point might change over time, and you have to get ready in order to be active in those fields where we not really do that kind of a business.
Really appreciate you sharing that, because I think always from those things that may not really succeed at the biggest level, we learn also a lot of things. It's this idea that behind failures, there's lots of lessons learned as well. So last question is a bit more of a bigger picture, up in the clouds one. If you had a magic wand, like a magician, and you could just, wish for anything you wanted, what would you wish for that could multiply the impact that you have on the organization, on your industry, on the world, at least 10 times?
I think I would love speed and pressure. So far, we are in a Swiss environment. So if I talk on the Swiss market, we are very, nice with each other. Nobody is trying to attack anybody. We have a safe environment. The regularity is. So this means that, we can still look at the basics, to fix the core, and not really trying to get as ready as possible for the future. So if there's no attackers actually entering the market, we don't have to change that rapidly. So we can be lucky that the environment is calm, it's not changing or putting lots of pressure. However, if I think that we have to think about the consumer first and then to try to solve consumer problems, we might have to, we are not pushed enough internally in order to get there. It's always relevant, yes, that we are a customer-centric organization. Everybody wants us to talk about that, but in the very end, we are far away as an industry to be customer-centric, I would say. So I would love to have more speed and more changes and more pressure in the market, that we really fundamentally start thinking about where we have to do things different in order to be really, really relevant for the end consumer. Otherwise, it's just a matter of time until this happens. And this has a significant change from a managerial perspective, from a leadership perspective. But so far, nothing really significant has happened. Slightly small adaptations, which is fine, but fundamental changes are not there. Perhaps this might change with the Chinese environment, where you have the Ping An and Zhong'an doing this in a very digital and very powerful way. We might have some indication from the US, Amazon, Apple trying to do theirs on the health part, which will be very, I think, a very interesting aspect to look at it, because they will change slightly the game in the insurance market, also in the US. And then we might have somebody trying to also cope with the insurance environment in Europe or in Switzerland, and this might take just not longer, but it's just more difficult, much more difficult to do that. So I'd love to be more challenged as an insurance environment.
It very much resonates with what you shared in the beginning, that you love big challenges and complex challenges and hard to solve challenges. And it's very interesting, kind of like what you say there, because we are in a fairly comfortable spot in Switzerland still. And that kind of, you know, I don't know what you want to call it at the end of the day, but this challenge and this speed, I think is absolutely essential. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you, you know, diving into these topics. We're going to link below the video to your LinkedIn profile and also to company page, so people can have a bit more of an idea what you guys are up to and what's happening, and can also connect with you personally if there's something interesting to talk about. So thank you so much for being in the show. I really appreciate it.